Good morning, this is Mr. Clemmons. I'm here to make the video that I promised on mercantilism, so I look forward to talking to you guys about that. So what you'll want to do is get your Chapter 3 notes out on mercantilism and go down to the From Mercantilism to Imperial Dominion in that section of your notes, and I'll try to go over those and try to explain things a bit more. This is one of those things that come up on the AP exam as an essay quite often. Okay, looking at those notes, mercantilism as a moral revolution. Most European powers adopted mercantilism in the 17th century. The idea behind mercantilism stated that the power of the state, in other words, the country, depended upon its underlying economy than on its armies, more on its underlying economy than its armies. Power, therefore, came from wealth, which came from trade and colonies. Therefore, the state or the country must completely control commerce of its colonies, and commerce equals trade. However, there were disagreements over the best way to promote economic growth. The Dutch favored virtual free trade. The English favored state regulation of domestic and the imperial economy. So by creating economic incentives, states could induce their people to work to increase not only their own personal wealth and power, but that of the whole country. Now, one of the unusual things about this is that first, mercantilists assumed that the world contained a fixed supply of wealth. In other words, there was one pie with all the money and resources and everything in it, and the way that your country became the most powerful in the world was to control the largest part of this pie, or the most amount of the resources that were available. Now, today we know that's not true, and some had suspicions of that, but at the time, that's what some of them believed. Okay? Later, trade was seen as a way to increase wealth and ensure peace, because if nations were interdependent, they would not go to war against each other. In other words, the idea is that if you have a trading partner and you're making money and they're making money, why would you attack them? Why would they attack you? Why would you mess that up if both are being successful? Mercantilism is also associated with the emerging idea of unending progress. And that's the idea that we're constantly moving forward in civilization and in thought and ideas and education, things like that. The Navigation Acts. Now, this is what the British set up on with the American Empire as well as overseas colonies in other parts of the world. So it's not just the United States, not just the American colonies that it does this for. The Navigation Act of 1651 excluded the Dutch and the French vessels by declaring ships that carried material goods from the colonies must be owned by the English or by the colonists. A second Navigation Act, Act number 2, in 1660, and the Staple Act of 1663 required that sugar and tobacco be exported only to England. Imports to the colonies could only come through England. Policies were backed by the English Navy, who forcibly drove the Dutch out of the Atlantic in 1664. That's how the American colonies gained New Netherland, and it became New York, and how Delaware became a part of the American colonies as well. Okay? Now, imports to the colonies can only come through England. English cracked down on colonies by denying Massachusetts Bay a claim to New Hampshire. Because the colonists had been ignoring mercantilist laws and maintaining trade relations with the Dutch. In 1684, the Massachusetts Bay Charter was annulled, in other words, taken back as punishment for smuggling. So Massachusetts was very big into smuggling with the Dutch. The Plantation Duty Act, the fourth of these navigation acts, required colonial ships to post bond in the colonies that they would deliver all enumerated commodities to England, or else pay on the spot the duties that would be owed to England. So this one had a specific list. Always before they had just talked in general terms. Now there's a specific list. And if things are not on the list, you can trade with the Dutch or French or whomever else and stuff. But if they are on the list, you have to only trade with England. All right? So these acts were designed to dislodge the Dutch and establish English hegemony or dominance over Atlantic trade. They worked partly because they were not accompanied by efforts to control other aspects of colonial life. Trade was the only target of increased British scrutiny. Now, one of the things that's very important to know about this is that when it comes in terms of regulating trade, and you might be thinking, Mr. Clemmons, why don't the colonists reject this at this point in time? Only about 5% of the American colonies were involved in trade. So when 5% of the people are affected by this and 95% of the people are not, the colonists are not going to revolt against that. Okay. Second, the Lords of Trade and Imperial Reform. English politics in the 1670s and 1680s had a profound impact on the colonies. The Duke of York became the most powerful shaper of imperial policy. Remember, he's the brother of the King Charles II. The Lords of Trade was established in 1675 as a permanent committee of the Privy Council. Privy Council are advisors to the king or queen. It was charged with enforcing the Navigation Act and administering the colonies. The West Indies became the object of most new policies due to the centrality to international competition. Now, Jamaica was making more money than many of the 13 colonies were at the time. The Crown took control of the governments of Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean in the 1660s. These colonies were required to pay the cost of their own government. Okay, so this is a long time before the Americans were required to pay that. Bacon's Rebellion and Metacom's War prompted greater English interest in the mainland colonies. So when there was trouble in the American colonies, the British got more interested in what was going on there. Okay. The Lords of Trade viewed New England and all the proprietary colonies with deep suspicion due to their autonomy, due to the ability that they can make their own laws. Assemblies were granted to Virginia and New York in exchange for permanent revenue acts. The death of Charles II in 1685 raised the specter of vigorous autocracy in America as James Forney, the Duke of York, assumed the throne. Remember, we talked about with James, the Duke of York, when New York was founded, James, the Duke of York, tried to rule it like a little kingdom and stuff and all. He believed in the divine right of kings, and so now that he's the King of England, then, all right, trouble's going to ensue. In 1695, the Lords of Trade was renamed the Board of Trade and given responsibility supervising colonial trade. In 1696, the Navigation Act of 1696 was passed and reinforced the act that said trade could be done only with English colonial ships. It also added sugar, tobacco, and indigo to the list of enumerated items. In 1733, by 1733, the molasses trade had turned in rum into the trade. Let me start over there. By 1733, molasses turned rum into the triangular trade, was the largest money maker for the British Empire. Therefore, Parliament passed the Molasses Act of 1733 to tax the trade in molasses. It was big money for the British. Protecting the mercantile system. Georgia was founded in 1732 by proprietor James Oglethorpe. It was to be a buffer zone between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. Originally, they hoped to grow grapes and silkworms, and their original constitution banned slavery. However, the silkworm died, and they couldn't grow grapes very well. So eventually, they became a smaller version of South Carolina, based along the Savannah River with slavery. Remember, South Carolina, their main crops were indigo and rice. Commercial aggression. Britain's efforts to develop Georgia to protect the valuable rice-growing colony of South Carolina outraged Spain, because remember, the Spanish were in control of Florida, which stepped up their seizure of illegal traders, in the process mutilating an English sea captain, Robert Jenkins. They cut off his ear. Okay? The War of Jenkins' Ear. Now, this does play into this whole thing because, remember, it's all about successful trade and making money off your colonies. 18th century imperial competition led to British involvement in a war with Spain, the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739-1741, and with France, the so-called War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. In the colonies, it was known as King George's War, the whole thing there. There was limited fighting in British North America. In the peace treaty, the French regained Louisburg, the fort guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. The tune that came, the Star-Spangled Banner, came out of this war. So, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? Well, that was a British drinking song, and someone took that song and turned it into, oh, say, can you see, the Star-Spangled Banner, that tune, okay? Anyway, mercantilism and the American colonies. Sorry, let me say this about the tune. It's the tune, not the words. Francis Scott Key is going to write the words to the Star-Spangled Banner later on, but the tune came out of this war. It's an old British drinking song. Okay, mercantilism in the American colonies. The politics of mercantilism. Britain allowed Americans to own ships and transport goods. Colonists made significant gains in control of exports during the 18th century, the 1700s. The American colonies increased trade relationship with the French Sugar Islands. Now, lack of currency in the colonies further complicated financial relationships. American merchants used bills of exchange and the gold and silver coins earned in the West Indian trade until colonial assemblies created public land banks to lend paper money to farmers who pledged their farm as collateral. In 1751, Parliament passed the Currency Act, which barred New Englanders from establishing new land banks and prohibited the use of publicly issued paper money to pay for debts. So there's no more paper money in New England, and it's now invaluable. That's going to make it difficult. It's going to send New England into a depression that's going to last up until 1775. Now, the English attempt to regain control of colonial economic pursuits in the late 1740s, British officials vowed to reassert their power in America, an initiative that proved to be and have disastrous results. Okay? Now, remember, in the early days of mercantilism, only 5% of Americans were involved in colonial trade, and therefore the majority of the 13 colonies and majority of people in the 13 colonies did not care about that. So mercantilism is an important idea to know about and be aware of. It's one of those topics that comes about every 2 or 3 years on the AP exam. So be sure and use these notes and go over them, and later we'll have you guys work on an essay outline for these. Okay? Thanks for your time today. I hope you're doing well. Bye-bye.